Hello everyone, today we talk about Kushan warfare. We already talked about Kushan warfare, that is a slightly different thing, and another thing entirely depending on sort of the level of superimposition of certain populations in Central Asia you want to intend. This is just an overview, by the way, about actually a very big chapter of Central and Southern Asian history, right? Politics and warfare. Looking really at the essentials of the Kushan military. And a bit of ethnography is naturally required. I would like also to maintain like sort of an Eastern perspective, and especially the Chinese one, because actually the Han historians are sort of, in spite of certain uncertainties, sort of more insightful about the origins of these peoples that, as you know, were related at least to the Yuezhi, this nomadic pastoralists living in essentially the today's like arid grassland area in the western part of the modern Chinese province of Gansu during the first millennium BC. And this people was crushed by the Xiongnu in 176, splitting into groups, migrating to different directions, the greater and the lesser Yuezhi. The latter would end up settling on the southwards on the edge of the Tibetan plateau, and they are reported having settled among the Qiang people in Qinghai, and to have even participated to the Liang province rebellion. We talked about Tibetan warfare, so if you're interested, you want to go check that out. From antiquity to Kublai Khan, that there's a video right there. And in this case, they would essentially be fighting against the Eastern Hans. There are voices saying, that they even founded the city of Kumuja, that is today known as Kumulan Ami, in the Eastern Tarim Basin. We, as we were saying before, observed Kushan warfare, and so the city-states also surrounding it in the Tarim Basin that had an important level of sort of Indo-European self-awareness and identity, remaining for a long time until the Turkic invasions, fundamentally having an interesting military on their own, a bit more civilized and sanitarized than the nomadic pastoralists. There are other branches of the so-called Lesser Yuezhi that may have become part of the Jie people of Shaanxi, right, and establishing the later Zhao state of the 4th century AD. We're not really sure about this too, but the main branch, like the Greater Yuezhi, are essentially what we are looking at now, because essentially the Kushans would derive actually from these people that for the Chinese was just yet another barbarian tribe of the West. We talked somewhat about already some relations between the Celestial Empire and these Central Asian nomads, right? So the considered the origin of these peoples was commonly Aryan, right, in Indo-European, and they are recurrently described by the Chinese historians together with the Bactrians and the Sogdians that we described in their warfare, together with the aforementioned Tokharians of the Tarim Basin, as having reddish hair and green eyes, right? Which, say, ethnologically speaking, tells, of course, of that, of course, Indo-European root. And it's something incredibly important to stress, because at this time, as you know, the Aryans essentially controlled up to very, very, very far east, right? People think, well, okay, well, there were Indo-Europeans, then fundamentally these Turco-Mongols that would have had their spaces. But those were just like the fringes of the steppes, some incredibly underdeveloped areas, and the Indo-Europeans had taken over, like, historically an enormous amount of land. And that's something I like always to recognize. It could have gone as far and as early as the Indo-Europeans actually founding the same Chinese empire originally, like as a dynasty, or ruling dynasty. Of course, there is no proof for this, but it's absolutely plausible, considering the circumstances. The spread of chariot warfare made some videos about that too, right? So today we follow essentially the greater Yuezhi. There are some, let's say, the main problem with these associations is that they're like we don't have the precise dates, the precise coordinates. We just go by major chunks of connections that, however, in this case, should be relatively uncontroversial. For example, there are some historians that associate the Yuezhi, and in this sense the later Kushan, with the Wuzun as well, that we will look at later, but apparently there is no at least simple superimposition of two terms. As a matter of fact, actually Wuzun fought against these the Yuezhi, the greater Yuezhi, and even if they had sort of come to be part of their dominions, or vice versa at some other point, where initially, especially, like that's another story. In any case, the greater Yuezhi migrated fundamentally northwest after having, as we've seen, been crushed by the Xiongnu in the 2nd century BC into the Li Valley. That is basically in today's borders of China and Kazakhstan, right? And as such, they established themselves as still a cohesive force among essentially a Saka population mostly. That was also in part displaced. There wasn't there a major power to simply destroy. In any case, this is where the relation with the Wuzun comes into play, because the former displaced the same Yuezhi from the Li Valley, obliging them to migrate southward further, up to Sogdiana and later even Bactria, right? And the connection with the latter is important because the term Tokaroi is brought about. The Sanskrit is Tukara, but they're also called Asi or Asioi by the Hellenic sources of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom that, as you know, had been established as a consequence of Alexander's conquest. So here, like, actually this had already, the kingdom already existed, and these peoples arrived at that time. And this is really fascinating for a number of reasons. Essentially, also the fact that we can sort of pin the Kushan, the later Kushan, down into the same Tokaroi of the sources, the connection again with the Yuezhi, etc. It sort of completes the circle that the ancient Chinese historians had drawn. A little word about Wuzun that we named. So for the sake of completion, we can distinguish a little bit better from the Kushans. These were yet another essentially semi-nomadic steppe people that appear in the Chinese records from the 2nd century BC to the 5th AD. And they originally lived between the Kilian Mountains, the Dunhuang, this is also Gansu. So they were actually the Yuezhi's neighbors, historically. And they are comminated also by the fact that when, in the aforementioned 176, the Xiongnu raided the Yuezhi's lands, the latter actually crushed the Wuzuns, killing their sovereign and essentially taking part of their land. So the reason how, like, eventually the Wuzun would survive and strike back, and that they were subsumed at this point by the bigger power, the Xiongnu, and that also made the surviving Wuzun prince one of their generals, and as leaders of at this point of this recompacted Wuzun, right? And that's the point at which the Wuzun would later attack the same Yuezhi, and we are likely around 133, 132 BC. So the Wuzun actually pushed west. So we have seen the Li River Valley that's in the Zetisu, right? But the Yuezhi had also occupied Tsungaria, the Tian Shan, that, as we know, is probably the single most hardcore central area of the spread of all, basically the top equestrian culture in Central Asia. So these are the actual deal. We're talking essentially about Scythian peoples, right? Except for the Tsung-Ling, that were something sort of different. But the Yuezhi were, like we're talking about, the broader sagas, right, in an broader ethnographic sense. After this point, like, the Wuzun settled in the Li Valley, so they dislodged the same Yuezhi, and they also became allies of the Han dynasty, also autonomizing themselves from the Xiongnu that initially had settled them in these areas as their own vassals fundamentally, but that eventually moved, as you know, further west themselves. The last mention we have of the Wuzuns comes from China. These people would have essentially settled in the Pamir Mountains, as we will see, had actually been close to the same Kushan lands under the pressure of the Ruran. And it's possible that the later Ephthalites actually had chunks of the Wuzuns with them. And the same thing can be said for the Kushan in some part. Today I'm going very fast, right? We're gonna, of course, skip all this, the detail of this macroscopic, enormous things. As if you, at some point, we will, if you want, look at them in sort of greater depth, right? But today we want just to essentialize. I don't know even if it's a verb that I made it up right now. Say Kushan's warfare, because it's in its essentials is important to understand, especially also as far as the fact that the Indo-Scythians in fact settled in India. And so we have already looked actually at ancient Indian warfare in some depth even, and we will have to actually continue to do so. And these Scythian peoples essentially grafted themselves onto that reality and began to command, of course, this the Indian subjects, and also getting a lot, of course, of influence from the same, right? And even from actually the Roman Empire, from Persia, because this power was located in a very central way historically, right? And maintaining also a very important foothold still in parts of Central Asia that were just next to, like, I don't know, places like Arakusia that were just next door to the Parthians, for example. So they're not really far away in a broader Western sense. You realize that there was also a great deal of Hellenic influence, as we've seen from places like Bactria, but from the same Rome. Think about the Roman temples in Malabar, and the fact that the West, say Western India, had very, very intense contact with Rome in the first place. So here the Kushans were a bit all in between, without mentioning that they also were subjected, when they had established their Indo-Scythian kingdom in the Indian subcontinent, to the Chinese, to the Eastern Han. And we will see it in a while with their defeat at the hand of Ban Chao. Overall, we do not know too much about the Kushan people in its steppes origin. We just have not much of a mystery, as we've seen, because we can't get more or less what happened with a good degree of accuracy, but everything is sort of confused. Why? Because most of the the sources that we really rely on to, for example, just establish a chronicle of the reigns of the early Kushan kings, so the guys who sort of made it all, are Chinese accounts that are somewhat confused about the chronology And especially in the moment in which this gets, it tries to be paralleled with the same Chinese ones. So there is this sort of peculiar confusion that the Chinese had about the events of these peoples that legitimately were just Western barbarians in their mindset, but that objectively had been moving quite importantly, as we've seen also with by the hands of peoples that had harassed the same Chinese, etc. And there were many tribes, of course, of Indo-European nomads out there, and we can't, of course, pretend the Chinese to be perfectly precise about this stuff. In any case, when we look at the height of the Kushan Empire, aside from the vast parts of the essentially northwestern Indian subcontinent, we look at territories essentially encompassing Afghanistan, Turkestan, Bukhara, parts of what is today's the Russian Turkestan. So really an immense power that, of course, was very much like a sort of broader dominion based on deterrence on this the centralization, possibility of raids on a fairly large scale that would keep all these other populations under, right? And gradually, in these centuries, the Indo-Europeans were, in these steps, sort of socially stratifying more, in part even slightly sedentarizing, at least for nomadic standards, which also would bring to their softening, to their part also their fragmentation as single coalitions, confederacies, and eventually be overrun by the Turks just a couple of centuries later. So the Kushans are also like one of the last glorious chapters in this history, and already, as we've seen, having been displaced by the Xiong, that, as you know, some associate with the Hans in a broader sense. Now, we'll not talk about that. I made a video about the Hannic identity, or at least how the issue is fundamentally dealt with historiographically, and how it's popularly reflected. It's another story, but we'll talk more about the Hans and their origin, of course. So the only the only surviving recorded contact between Kushan India and China is related to the tale of the Battle of Panchal winning the Kushans. This is worth observing just briefly, because it's well summed up in one of Chavan Tung Pao articles. Tung Pao is an important ethnographical journal, right? And you can't find the information there. Of course, in the consideration on the sources, that you must be able to handle it with considerable philological, linguistical, and historical expertise. Now, Panchal, as you know, was an interesting figure. He was originary of the Eastern Han Dominion. I made something about the Han's military. We have to come back on a bit more in detail. Who was appointed general of the Western frontier, the massive Western frontier that we have had the opportunity of observing already in other videos, like the aforementioned one about the Tibetans, the Chinese expeditions to that Central Asian hinterland, the sort of offensives in the same China. And the Western frontier, as you know, was just like the toughest area in many ways in terms of political and strategical challenges. It was a decentralized territory, was poor, less developed. There were all these barbarians around harassing you, and of course China cared very much about these lands because they controlled the Silk Route, plus the access to the splendid war horses that the Hans, in fact, were importing from the finest Fergana breeds. I made a video about those under the Persian horse, like it was something more for Hellenistic Achaemenid warfare, but they're the same breed basically, and I discussed the issue there. For their own heavy cavalry, that was properly at some point it was an important reform in their military that literally began to breed on a very large scale, to say the least, all across China, these mounts, and an important supply, right, from the contact with this barbarian. So positive connections, relations, etc., had to be maintained. It's a very, very delicate frontier. And Pan Chao is, I'm not sure whether I pronounce it correctly because the transliterations vary, but who cares, right? He was actually a very famous general of his times, glorious one, and also thanks to the histories connected with him that are actually some of the most important for the Han period, right? And Pan Chao literally fought against Kushan India, or at least in the north of it. There is a bit of a problem concerning the precise dating of the battle for the aforementioned Chinese issues, like the fact that we do not even know with certainty when the Kushan rulers Vima, Kadphises, and Kanishka I were actually in power. However, the battle happened likely in 90 AD, right? The events that follow this battle are dated in the aforementioned Shavan work for more sort of chronological clarity. So Pan Chao was heavily involved from a military point of view against the tribes and lands of the Tarim Basin. That was crucial for, again, controlling the Silk Routes, important points of access to the, again, aforementioned horses, the heavenly horses for the imperial Chinese cavalry, and the possibility, in fact, of expanding further west. All right. The subjugation of the Tarim Basin had been fully accomplished. Nobody would rebel. They all obeyed Pan Chao, who pushed westwards. At this point, he would enter essentially the Kushan territory that was, as we've seen, very vast. Right? The Chinese general skirted the northern edge of the Pamirs Mountains that, as you know, are located at a junction with other notable mountains, namely the aforementioned Tian Shan, the Karakoram, the Kunlun, the Hindu Kush, the Himalaya mountain ranges. So, especially in the west, extremely important to eventually control the passes towards India that the same Kushans controlled. Reason for which the Kushan rulers found themselves threatened by this invasion and sent a force of namely 70,000 cavalry. We will look at essentially like a breakdown what we think like a Kushan army organic really was, but as you understand from this, like it was mostly like a mounted and lightly unarmored cavalry in the typical Scythian fashion. But 70,000 is perhaps really too much, right? We have sort of this grandiose numbers in historical records. This means, of course, like a very large force that, in fact, had also a really tough time in crossing the Tsung-Ling mountain range to intercept Pan Chao's forces. In fact, the mountain crossing was, mistaken for another, which means that the Kushans found themselves in the wrong place, and even worse, at the wrong time of the year, right? Which brought to disastrous losses into the army during the crossing, even before the arrival against the Chinese. This seemingly crippled probably the Kushan army that, however, didn't give up, right? As soon as they emerged from the mountains, this gigantic just logistical feat, like at this point, just extremely well organized and powerful armies could do this in this number, right? So it's just like an Olympic feat managed to be pulled off, just like the Chinese of conquering the Tarim Basin in many ways had been. And they say the two forces committed to fight. Now, we do not have too much tactical details, unfortunately. We just know that Ban Chao easily defeated what had been by then the exhausted Kushan army after the mountain crossing. After this glorious endeavor, China would receive tribute from the Indian kingdom. Let's talk about the Kushan army organization. By the way, this is not my very first video about the Kushans. At least I made one from the Eurasian Steppes Warfare series together with other peoples. You know that in those videos I list, like, I don't know, 3-4 peoples and compare them within a specific age, like in the development of the art of war of the Eurasian steppes. So there is already some essentials there, and even something put more in perspective with our peoples in this regard. But we are discussing here not merely some abstract Scythians, but essentially the most developed of the sagas, right, as far as the say the shock cavalry and heaviness, literally, of cavalry force was involved. All right, you can sum up Kushan warfare by saying they had basically the usual narrow and hyper elite, both qualitatively and numerically, of ultra shock, traumatically, violent, overly developed land wasting cataphracts that would have, literally made people explode into pieces, like detached them in a normal charge. And much of that had been due, as we've seen, telling the truth, with the contact between the Scythians and the sedentary populations. We've seen how even probably Alexander's phalangites in places actually not far at all, actually in the same places ruled by the Kushans, had deeply impressed Scythian horsemen because of the heaviness, the compactness, right, of this of his host, and obliged them to develop this incredibly renewed shock power to literally compensate with the hardiness of the sedentaries infantry that had not been, let's say, that's a part of Western standards that had arrived at Far East, Central Asia, and India with Alexander, and that, at least in terms of infantry, had not, in fact, had never been witnessed by these other populations that at best knew, say, the Achaemenids. There were still some sort of, yes, they had prevalently infantry forces, but had a very strong cavalry bias at the same time, and in fact, their infantry is not being so solid, even just to receive the same degree of it, being definitely softer, like for when confronting this other sort of, say, steppes cavalry that were also subsumed, like by the Achaemenids and at the outskirts of the steppe, and brought to fight even as far as Greece. And just know that during the Persian Wars, if there was any literal Aryan from the homonymous tribe of Sagas, this was in the Achaemenid army as opposed to the Hellenic one, right? That's just, for actually highlighting how, as always, like the nomadic peoples were more aware about the movements of the sedentaries and sort of the broader range of horizon across the steppes towards those areas, then the centers actually were towards them, because that was some sort of a fringe that legitimately, say, more advanced civilizations did not really care about. But of course, it was just there were these continuous waves, right? Of people. So I just made a video some couple of weeks ago stressing how, like, the slightly later time, like the Romans, the Chinese, the Guptas, sort of dealt all with this challenge of maintaining the ecumenic character of the rule with different but also comparable outcomes. So when we look at the Kushan organization, we know that they used essentially Scythian tactics. They were of the same ancestral stock of the so-called Scythians. We'll talk them kind of more frequently at some point. I made some videos about Scythian warfare. If you're interested in those, you can already check out. So their armies did not really differ, as we've seen in the essentials, from the one of those people. Also because the steppes pretty much was dominated by them. There wasn't much of a significant divide within the same steppes, sort of more or less affluent tribes dominating over others fundamentally. Yeah, sure, also in the steppes, some sort of fringe, some areas were much more underdeveloped. And things were sort of setting in motion, like before also, that especially the far west would become acquainted with the consequences of the people's movements. Needless to say, from a numerical point of view, unarmored cavalry would dominate. All right, it would be a proportion of armored elite support being supported, if anything, by the lights. Right. An interesting addition, which we can see also in one of the coins of the Indo-Scythian kings that I uploaded here, are an animal that would actually serve many of the conquerors ruling in this area. That is the Bactrian camel, right? When the Arabs had to scope during the Islamic invasions north of Iran, fundamentally crossing these main ranges, very cold climates, etc., they would use themselves a Bactrian camel that is a very sturdy, reliable, sort of, in this sense, climate resistant type of mostly pack animal, but they could be ridden in part, and that would be perfect exactly for, as we've seen, even during the Chinese invasion of the Pamir Mountains, to move like the enormous amount of supplies that was needed, even by peoples that still, when in India and controlling like neighboring regions where mostly would still keep living in the semi-nomadic conditions, however, would always need an enormous amount of, again, material, of in fact food and so on, and so that could not quite simply be neglected. It's considered that the Pamir Mountains are just basically in between, say, if you look at west and east, respectively, Bactria and the Tarim Basin, right? Further north, you have, like, there is another range. I'm not sure whether it's part of the same Pamir, but the north of which would be the Fergana Valley. In the west of this, in the northwest of it, there is Sogdiana, right? So immediately south of that, you have places like Taxila, that, as you know, was an important city. The Kushan Empire was basically laying over the Indus Valley, right? Controlled as far as Saketa, say in the west, on the Indian Ocean, they close to Gedrozia, they had the port of Barbaricum, and in the northwest, say between Arakuzi and also in the Indo-Kush, you would have, and beyond, like, of course, towards Bactria, some land, plus in the same Tarim Basin, as considering that this had been controlled, in fact, also by the Kushan to some degree, as far as you see, we have Kashgar, Kucha, Turfan, what we talk about, Kushan warfare in general, because that was the most important center, been extending on that the control in those areas. So we do not have some major, say, indicators, counters of how, let's say, preserved would the Scythian steppe equestrian culture be maintained in India. Actually, India does have an important equestrian tradition. It's not just about infantry, and lots of infantry as definitely was. It was the elite lording over this masses of shockingly large masses of peasants were, of course, using not just horses, but also elephants. Yet, of course, the climate is different. You can't quite maintain the same degree of sort of steppe lifestyle and training and say gear in general, that and as if nothing had really changed, right? So we're not sure about what those allegedly 70,000 Kushans would have been, except they are told to be horsemen still. So we can imagine from India the rulers managing to exercise a sound power on an important amount of essentially still frontier peoples that would be mobilized against the various enemies further north, without mentioning the aforementioned crossing, failed crossing, or at least mistaken crossing of considering the various valleys of the Pamir Mountains, would have been carried out with all a degree of expertise from the same locals that were under the Kushan rule, etc. The Bactrian camels, just like the elephants in India, would help tremendously as far as logistics was concerned, because they could be barely almost the only animals to really be able to make that effort of transportation. Next, the cavalry horses in that context. Mm-hmm. We have a coin minted by the first Kushan king, Kuyula Kadphises, that portrays, as we're saying, one of these Bactrian camels on the obverse side of the coin, which also testifies to the relevance of this animal in the Kushan symbology, and so a bit the pride of their people as far as this reliability as a pack animal, more like would entail. Definitely a heritage, or part of the ancestral lands, a common beast of burden. After the northern Indian subjugation by the Kushans, which is, of course, before the Chinese, as we've seen, not really entering contact, because contacts did exist, but say in a more direct military sense that at least we're aware of, we could, of course, expect a substantially large number of Indian forces that, as we've seen in our videos, are at this point mostly infantrymen, numerically. Then you have, of course, cavalry, also chariotry, that is very important since, of course, also Vedic times, elephants. And these forces would remain essentially part of a lower condition of the subjected peoples, especially the infantry. Then cavalry, chariotry, the elephants, etc., would belong to, of course, Indian aristocrats, noblemen that, of course, would marry into the same Indo-Scythians and, let's say, achieve some degree of superiority, also because these were traditionally the caste, the military caste, so also one of the holy warriors, and so they had all a metaphysical raison d'etre in the continent that you couldn't really do without if you wanted to rule it in the first place. Naturally, we're not much documented about this, but of course, this injection of further northern rulers, as far as especially their Indo-European ancestry was concerned, surely reactivated some older say, reinvigorated some older, say, influences, at least from that ancient Aryan tradition. I made a video about the Vedic religion, and so what the myths of also many Kushans at this point would have been revived by the way that belief had sort of also developed further during the centuries in India. For the rest, the Kushans were, however, the ruling people, the governing conquerors. And as such, their steppes chivalric culture was preserved, as we've seen, or was an attempt to preserve it intact. As such, it would have, similarly to their kin, remained decimal in nature. Like in the steppe, there is this quite immediate sort of numerical round, because there are huge numbers. And so actually there is something similar in India for similar reasons, except it's a sedentary one. So perhaps, who knows, there were some weird matches as far as that was concerned. We know that chariotry was still taught under the reign of Kaniska, one of the Indo-Scythian rulers. We are around 144 AD. So we can think that chariotry played an important role in the Kushan army. We do not know, however, how much this was true out there in the steppes, because gradually, say, chariot warfare was abandoned. It was something that properly ended first in the steppe, as it had been the first place where the chariots had spread from. That when cavalry started becoming a true arm, right, it sort of did so from the same places, with the ever more unprejudiced use of the horse. And it's rather in the sanitary world, India included, that chariotry was properly a thing for smashing in a much more different way, especially at this point, from the Bronze Age. This is smashing, that were chariots, in Bronze Age, as we've seen in many videos, were much more, even though they did smash, that had that purpose, were also secondarily as shooting platforms, and they were very agile, right? They also acted in solo. Instead, in the first millennium BC, the chariot, you can see it also in Mesopotamia with the Seleucids, etc., becomes ever bigger and rarer, right? And it has the purpose of literally being thrown as a massive projectile against very densely packed formations. And in India, that is a bit of a wilder place, when there is a lot of, say, some areas are highly civilized, but others are, say, overall, we're talking about an incredibly uncontrollable system. This is the problem of India, as always, for any conqueror. It's immense. It is this monstrously demographic, cauldron that never settles. The local nobility, of course, takes advantage for the difficulties of a public authority to be established. They subject vast masses of people that allow them to have this private armies on a provincial basis that are mostly cavalry, so they're mounted based, and it can include still the chariot, also because of the, say, many areas that are pretty flat and, say, suited to that kind of warfare still. So we will talk perhaps a bit more in depth about the survival of chariot warfare in India, but here we see that if Kaniska, that was, however, settled properly in the Indian subcontinent by the 2nd century, they still use a chariot in, say, with a military function, not just a representative one like, I don't know, the Romans could have and would have. Look at the Antonines in the same period. There was definitely some say, continuity from a time in which, of course, the memory had survived of the mounted nature of the conquerors, right, of the heroes. that that there is all a symbology about blue-eyed, blonde-haired deities of Apollonian rule. And if you look at the phenotype, the anthropic types we've seen here, there is no doubt that also genetically that these guys, that the conquerors, were very fair, and they were sort of very much embodying that sense of the heavenly race, which, as we've seen, was true also for the horses. And so this incredibly tough breeds of men and animals that had been molded in Central Asia at this point for millennia, being the top warrior cultures that you could really have. So we're being really, fortunately, we do not know too much about the Kushans at a deeper level, but that's always a problem with India. That may have been an enormous system, but it was never as civilized as China or Europe, right? And people often confuse these levels, thinking that big means more advanced. It's not really how it works, or necessarily how it works. It's a matter of quality internally, also to big systems. So attentively, we could approximate the composition of the Kushan army as something like an overwhelming majority of horse archers. Let's be honest about this. Speaking of armored cavalry, we shouldn't think of it being actually that rare at all, especially since the Kushans took over India. And so they had really massive feudal estates, which they could breed literally the toughest levels of ultra-heavy cataphracts that had ever been seen. This had a very firm Saka tradition. We see tubular, say the equivalent of the Manica in Latin. This thing had been existing all across the world, right? And had a Scythian derivation to some extent, for protecting mostly the horsemen from the hails of arrows of the steppe. The same Indo-Europeans, as we've seen, had been sort of feudalizing within the same Central Asia by this point, so things had become incredibly heavy, and we'll surely make some videos specifically about the unit types. Now we'll also talk briefly about them as far as the Kushans are concerned, but something in ultra depth as far as probably the horse barding, etc. In the Eurasian steppes warfare, see a lot of this, and say showing how things sort of evolved over time according to the specific military needs of these peoples. So that could have not been so strange to have at least armored cavalry, not of the ultra heavily armored type. It was definitely a very expensive thing. Like, it cost an enormous structural deal, and just we do not know how better, unfortunately, how the Kushan army was organized, but we can assume, of course, there being an adequate level of power concert. We will talk again more in depth about the Indo-Scythians, because it's not just about the Kushans. Actually, there's the Greek Bactrian kingdom as well. So plenty of stuff to actually observe attentively in some evolution of the same armies say in India under these conquerors. So that's actually very relevant. You have different waves of conquerors that sort of bring each one their own enhanced cataphract versions, right? For that history of the steppe, as gradual was also important, very technical. Actually, say gradual but fast, considering the times and the places. After all, you would have an armored cavalry used properly in a military function. You would have a congruous number of skirmishers of sort. There would be armored infantry, if we consider, as we'll see now better, how often actually would cavalry dismount, especially considering that they had settled in India and they would have had just to fight against walled cities in a more sort of wooded terrain, sort of something different from the steppes. So we can think of like small very expensive, of course, units of charioteers and elephants that would have not surpassed, like individually, I think, like 1/20th of the army overall. But they still exist, and as we've seen, they were relevant. Again, something a bit more in depth is needed to. I'm sure there is plenty of information, or at least of hints, that can help sort of reconstructing the organic better. I wanted to say that if you look at the territories covered by the Kushans, as we were saying before, there were also, say, mountainous areas, sort of sanitary populations also, not just in India, but in the north, further. Bactrian part, being, of course, a sanitary one, as we've seen, the Tarim Basin was, say, sanitary as far as the various cities scattered along the perimeter of the mountain ranges that protected the same cities that also were along the main river courses, because in between it's fundamentally a desert. And the point being there that, you see, this place is, so this type of territory, like think about the Timurids or the Mongols, like there is always, like, between the sort of eastern Iranian, Central Asian, like places like Afghanistan, you see here, like the Hindu-Kush, etc., like this sort of more turbulent warlike peoples that sort of come to conquer and rule the southern, sort of more obedient ones, say subservient ones. And in the first group, there is plenty of sanitaries as well that in fact fight on foot, also very poorly, just as primitive warriors. And so when we looked before at javelin men, for example, or we didn't mention an armored infantry, but there would have actually been, in some places of the steppes, there were some sort of say infantry militias, right, that had to cope in those tiny oases of fertile land, like with the raiders of the steppe, and so must had also some important capacity of the important cohesion. That it's not much just how much armor you have on, but say how cohesed truly as a community you are. Like you see this larger shields, even sometimes importantly long spears, etc., making some sort of walls around their settlements, their ditches, their palisades. All these did exist. The same Kushans would control the mountain passes, the valleys, etc., by settling not just the horsemen, like on the pastures for their mounts, but also through these villagers, these people living literally at the borders, like with difficulty distinguishable from the same semi-nomads, but that had some sort of more evidently settled lifestyle, right? And after all, what the nomads really wanted was places like India, right? And so settling down, in a way, becoming a landowner, had a better life than doing hand in the steppe. So if we were to stereotype a bit like these guys, let's start from the aforementioned lighter infantrymen, right? Not the Indian ones, we will see them now, but just this Kushan light troopers, right? That would have been some Bactrian Scythian in stock, right? There is a sculpture found at Mathura that represents the typical Kushan dress that could have been worn by some of these troops, even as lancers or skirmishers. Helmets would have been surely also for this lower status troops, like of Scythian origin, because that was sort of the hegemonic military culture also materially in that world, and they sort of all were of that Iranian stock. We can imagine some short swords, typically mostly small spears and bucklers, as just I would say the most typical of this kind of troops, because yes, we said there were sort of relatively even resilient infantries, but they weren't really the norm. The average trooper would have been just a guy carrying out hit and run tactics, even without a horse, because that's sort of, in fact, how short they could be out there in the opening without cover, so they had to be agile and ready to get the hell out of the way. And still, like in more, in fact, defense perimeters, being able to put up like a sort of tougher fight. Indian troops, of course, these were present in, say, overwhelming numbers in the Indian subcontinent under in the Kushan armies. There are interesting figures from the 2nd century AD, the beginning of it, Gandhara, that would sort of exemplify what the native Indian fighters look like. The Kushan Empire was established fundamentally through the conquest of the Indians, roughly around 50 AD. All right, so also the aforementioned time that the Kushans faced the Chinese near to the Pamir Mountains, they were, of course, new conquerors, and yet they would already bring some Indian forces to fight there. The dhoti was the uniform garment. We do not know much about the colors involved, but there was surely some form of uniformity tribally among the Kushans, whichever devices were used to distinguish one another. In India, there was surely also something similar, depending on the various lords of their houses, how that some of their militias were, say, issued like, I don't know, common clothes for reasons of esprit de corps, tactical purpose. It would have not been normal, like Indians also fought times naked, right? So not necessarily had to be recognized. It wasn't this incredibly sophisticated infantry, say, tactics around. But some of the toughest troops that were also guard units, etc., that were, of course, used by the Kushans, would have been uniformed in that way. We do not know whether shield devices were painted and on or raised, but there were different methods. No armor was pretty typical. We have, for this reason, pretty chopping weapons, including the typical Indian Nimstrisa, that is 10 centimeters wide in blade, which tells you, like, some of these words were actually a big deal, right? And just great warriors could wield them. But generally speaking, with all these light troops around, the same top warriors that truly mostly fought against one another, but could switch to these choppers to chop to pieces. In fact, as many people they could. We will talk more about armored units in ancient Indian warfare that weren't really that normal, considering the average, but still existed, and in fact had this. They had also this more agile, light bias, but they had sometimes this tremendous weapons. By the way, you could have seen strange mixes, such as Scythian caps within the Indian infantry, right? And that's absolutely plausible. We do not know too much in the probably daily reality, because of course much of the art is very stylized, and of course again Indian clothing was very, very sort of primal and, you know, not particularly developed, but especially in combat, like we see mostly lighter unarmored troops at least. So actually the most shocking element on the battlefield in many ways would have been the heavy cavalry the Kushans could field. Today we do not talk about the Indian cavalry, the ethnic one, because of course it was present but described it elsewhere. If anything, we will talk more about the Kushan, sort of the Indian horses. That's an interesting topic, given that these conquerors needed supplies of their own ancestral mounts that were the pride of the world, but they would have needed also to mount local horses. In any case, the necessity for mounts like the Ferganas, for example, was surely connected with the cataphract cavalry. We can't think of massive equipment in all its technicality that now we can say skip. It depends really on what units we're discussing. We can't think the average cavalry length was not even that long, like something between 1.5 meters, 2 meters, right? In that sense, it would have been used still in a shock fashion, not in a missile role, but there were actually some longer weapons developed in the steppe at a point. The heavy infantry component of the Kushan army would have used a round shield, like 70 centimeters in diameter. Cavalry probably used the same type, so there wasn't too much need of protection, shield protection, when armor was well developed. There was a great sense of collective training, by the way, that required mostly the concentrated mass of the horsemen, like smashing orderly to an enemy line. There were differences in helmets and boots, for example, as far as the infantry and the cavalry was concerned. And it's possible, as we were saying before, that most Kushan heavy infantry was actually made up of dismounted heavy cavalrymen, just being equipped in the former case with some sort of bigger, more consistent shield, and being able also to put up a remarkable resistance against other cavalrymen depending on the situation. So we can think that actually this infantry component was sort of heavier or more effective on average than the same Indian ones, right, per capita, let's say. The Kushan leaders obviously had the best panoply available as possible. There is a beautiful statue of the King Kaniska we mentioned before. They're also inserted here. It's headless, right? But there are so many other Kushan kings represented that we can sort of imagine what they would look like. There's a rich numismatics, for example, with very interesting symbols, as we will see now. Also the lion. There is a Herculean symbol, for example, literally Hercules, like the lion skin, and there's all something connected there with symbolism brought from the steppes. The mace, just for talking Hercules here, was considered a symbol of rank, right, rather than a weapon of war, but never put limits to providence, for that matter. The clubs, especially in very radically armored context, of course, were very useful and very traumatic for everything underneath the same defenses, right? We see massive swords that really embody perfectly the chivalric, knightly essence of the Kushan leadership, right? They were, it's also pretty sturdy anti-armor weapon in many ways, and used also to, of course, stab, thrust in the joints properly of armor. Some parts were, of course, exposed. We talked about lamellar armor, as we will see now. The typical type of defense was lamellar, right? So here Kaniska doesn't have an armor because he's sort of more relaxed attire, but still, like, this elite had some of the best armor available in the world. The harness on Kanishka's boots may have supported spurs, but we do not know because unfortunately the rear parts of the statue have been broken. They may have actually been there. I made some observations about spurs in my video recently about the development of the stirrup. There are multiple videos, but the most recent one. Again, the upper chest and shoulder would have been worn again in combat, and they would have been again scale armor. We do not know, as we were saying before, what kind of fabric colors the Kushan used. Particularly, we have the sense of reddish golden, which is normally associated with the sakas in general. But there is a beautiful set of symbolism that especially elevates the lion. Right, there is a really high place that this animal has in Kushan life. And one of the pictures, I think you surely recognize one of the first. There is literally a lion on a pole. Like this is a banner fundamentally, and there were many. Like they were similar. Like these peoples standard to the ones of sedentary peoples, right? So that, as we've seen, their infantry forces would use them just like, I don't know, a Celt or a Dacian would have done it. So the symbols were also somewhat shared. The lion was a symbol of royalty, of course, but here we cannot exclude, of course, lots of other creatures and shades in that, like for example the panther as well, and that was a symbolism also in Alexander's army, leopard skin rather. So there is really a lot we could descend in the symbolism of it, but we will leave it for some history of religion videos, right? Because also about the Kushans, we do not have this overwhelming evidence for that matter. Speaking of the Kushan horse in India, now we have some reliefs in the British Museum that at least allow us, let's say, to reconstruct the trappings these horses could have. At least this is slightly later time. We mentioned Gandhara. This is about, say, half a century, full century later, the Kushan era. We do not see stirrups, and we may assume, however, that the Kushans would have been among the peoples who made sort of precocious use of it. So that the stirrup, we explained it in the aforementioned video, did not really spread as a cause of cavalry having. It was something connected with the levels of collective training of cavalry, shock tactics, even a bit the softening up of the hero, telling the truth, because of course these guys could smash into one another without auxilium of the stirrup. So this was just something easier to do, like with a physicality that gradually also in the steps was fading, right? The spread of stirrup is a consequence of these factors, it's not a cause of the having of cavalry, right? Or at least it is when this cavalry, of course, has those capacities to just shock with such a traumatic force that if you don't want to be catapulted out of the horse, you have in part, say, tying yourself to the saddle, using the stirrup, so trying to absorb as much as you can that kind of impact, because the shock is really enormous. You can literally be catapulted off the horse. The Indo-Scythians used the stirrup in general, so there is no reason why the Kushans, as the same people technically, would have not used it in their armies in India or so. So this is pretty much the picture. Very light. Again, there is more about each and all of these these different topics. But today we just wanted to introduce the Kushan, as far as their warfare was generally concerned, what kind of challenges they had to cope with, and sort of like what kind of military culture they would be able at some point also to preserve and to keep fostering, even after having been displaced from different areas. And especially meeting with essentially a sanitary reality that had not been their own, and so they had to manage in different ways. Much of also the way they would mix, say, more typically Indian units, say organization, weapons, etc. in their armies is fundamentally unknown. Of course, these peoples can't say that they simply come and go, but of course they don't have this pronounced sense of public culture, of statehood, and so on. It's really what they accomplish at a point is due to their warlike impetus, and then they sort of get absorbed, especially in India, by this much bigger, voracious system that sort of chews everything, like sort of regenerates within for the pieces within the same India in the process. There is all a history of India, and in fact later, in these and following centuries, that is really fascinating to observe. Also, as far as the decline of the territory is concerned, because this place has a much different military history from, it's a bit really a world on its own. Europe or China, there are all different reasons why certain things sort of decline later, for example. But these are things that we'll be looking at some other videos. Like also what is important is the Chinese connection historically, and we'll have to get a bit more in depth into Chinese warfare as long as we proceed with it. There's really so much to cover more, and starting from these introductions is always important. For today, however, I stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.